Two towering Apache sisters chained like cattle in the middle of a dusty frontier town. Everyone thought they were doomed. But one man's memory of loss would make him risk everything to set them free. What happened next changed their lives. And his forever. Watch closely, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more true Wild West stories. The morning sun scorched the dusty main street of Blackwater Crossing, turning the wooden planks and loose soil into a hazy golden blur. I had come to the market for the usual: feed, tools, and the occasional gossip from folks I barely knew. But today, the scent of oppression hit me before I even entered the square. It was subtle at first, a mix of sweat, fear, and leather. Then I saw them. Two women, tall as the tallest men I'd ever seen, were chained to a crude auction post. The crowd around them buzzed with a low murmur of curiosity and greed. They weren't ordinary captives. Anyone with eyes would notice that instantly. Their eyes burned with a quiet fury, dark pools reflecting the injustice that held them in chains. I knew the weight of loss, the sting of helplessness, and something in me ached at the sight. Their height was almost surreal, each of them brushing 7 feet. Their frames were lean, muscular, built by survival rather than comfort. One had the calm of a predator studying her surroundings, while the other's eyes flitted with the calculated caution of someone who had learned to survive by anticipating every threat. The auctioneer, a greedy-eyed man with a voice like gravel, pounded the podium and called for bids as if they were sacks of grain rather than human beings. I felt my fists clench and unclench. Memories I had long buried came rushing back, the sound of fire devouring my homestead, the lifeless eyes of my brother lying in the dust, the hollow ache when a parent's laughter no longer greeted me at dawn. My heart was pounding in my chest, a drumbeat of urgency that demanded action. I had exactly $347 to my name, barely enough for feed and supplies for the season, but the thought of leaving these women behind, of letting the crowd dictate their fate, was unbearable. I stepped forward, ignoring the curious and shocked eyes of the townspeople. The auctioneer's gaze flicked to me, a mixture of irritation and surprise as I raised my hand. My voice, normally quiet, rang clear across the square. 500, I said. The words were heavier than any gold coin, heavier than any bargain I had ever struck. I could feel the shift in the crowd, the collective intake of breath, and then the murmurs, questioning, debating, doubting. But the truth remained. I was committed. I had no time to negotiate in words. The rest of the money would have to come from the last vestiges of my family's legacy. My mother's wedding ring, my father's silver pocket watch, artifacts of a life that had been torn from me by fire and violence. But looking at the two sisters, standing tall despite the indignity and cruelty imposed upon them, I knew some things were worth more than memories, more than money. The auctioneer pounded his gavel, the sound echoing like a death knell across the square, yet it was a different kind of finality this time. "Sold," he barked, and the word fell into my chest like a hammer. The chains rattled as the women's wrists were freed, but neither of them moved away from the post immediately. There was caution, yes, but also a subtle assessment. They were learning me the way one learns a dangerous animal, careful, deliberate, and utterly focused. I approached slowly, key in hand. "I'm going to remove these," I said softly. The older one's dark eyes met mine with a calculated scrutiny, while the younger stayed close, relying on her sister as she always had. I could see the strength in both of them, a legacy of ancestors who had stood as giants in the history of their people. This was not weakness. It was a challenge. As the shackles fell away, the sisters rubbed their wrists, raw and tender from the metal. They stayed where they were, eyes flicking from me to the crowd and back again. I offered them what I had, a small cabin, a handful of cattle, honest work. I did not promise comfort nor riches, but a place to belong while they figured out what came next. Slowly, carefully, they considered my offer, measuring me, weighing the risk against the possibility of freedom. The town buzzed around us, but I felt a strange quiet settle between the three of us. Trust would not come easily. Respect would not be given for free. But for the first time in what felt like decades, I was certain of one thing. Today, the world had shifted. The market square, once a place of greed and cruelty, had become a pivot point for something far more enduring, an alliance forged not by blood, but by the understanding that freedom and honor were worth far more than gold. As the sun climbed higher, I helped them to the wagon, watching the townsfolk scatter, their curiosity fading like dust in the wind. The ride back to my farm was silent, yet filled with a weight neither of us could deny. We were strangers in a world that had shown us its worst, yet bound together by a decision that would change all our lives. The wagon creaked under the weight of supplies as we approached the small rise that overlooked my modest ranch. From this vantage point, the land looked deceptively calm, rolling pastures bordered by jagged red cliffs, a seasonal creek snaking lazily through the valley, and the cabin that had stood for 2 decades, leaning slightly but solid. It wasn't much, certainly not the home they had been taken from, nor the freedom they had imagined, but it was honest land. And for the first time in months, it seemed like a sanctuary. The older sister, her posture still rigid, surveyed everything with hawk-like precision. Every ridge, every fence line, every shadow in the barnyard was assessed as if she were mapping a battlefield. The younger, slightly more reserved, stayed close, copying her sister's movements, her dark eyes scanning the surroundings in silent calculation. I had grown used to reading the signs of fear or hesitation in people, but there was none of that here. Only careful observation, the same way I studied the behavior of my cattle. We unloaded the wagon together. Their strength was formidable. Sacks of grain, water barrels, even the heavy iron tools were carried with an effortless grace that left me silently grateful. The older, taller one, whom I came to think of as Iona, moved with the kind of precision that came from years of practice in life-or-death situations. Every step was deliberate, every gesture purposeful. The younger, Ittel, though still recovering from the months of captivity, exhibited patience and resilience that spoke of quiet intelligence and measured strength. The cabin, small and unassuming, held just enough space for all three of us to find some comfort. I suggested they take the main room, offering the lofted area above the barn as an alternative for privacy and observation. Iona nodded, accepting without hesitation, and Ittel followed her sister's lead. The unspoken communication between them was flawless, built from a lifetime of shared experience, pain, and survival. I set to work showing them the ranch, how to tend the cattle, repair broken fences, and manage the water supply. They absorbed every lesson with astonishing speed, not as students to a teacher, but as equals analyzing and strategizing. Their eyes caught every detail, noting subtle signs of predator activity, grazing patterns, and hidden water sources that I had taken for granted. I realized quickly that I was learning as much from them as they were from me. The sun dipped lower as we finished the initial tour. Dust clung to our clothes, and the air smelled of dry earth and livestock. Iona pointed out a subtle weakness in the fence near the creek, evidence of unshod horses that had grazed there. I nodded, impressed. This wasn't just observation. It was survival instinct applied to ranching. They understood the land in ways I never could alone, reading it like an extension of themselves. As night settled over the valley, the quiet was a stark contrast to the noise of the market square earlier. The sisters moved with care, preparing what provisions we had brought, and I realized that the trust we were beginning to build was fragile but tangible. They were not here as servants, nor as charity cases. They were here as allies in survival. And I, for all my caution, had become part of that fragile network of trust. Later, as I repaired the barn gate under the fading light, I could hear Iona and Ittel whispering softly to each other, their voices low, measured. I didn't need to understand the words to know the meaning. They were strategizing, assessing, planning. These were women molded by hardship, not easily fooled or coerced, yet willing to extend their cautious trust. It was in that quiet, under the crimson sky of a western dusk, that I realized how precarious our situation truly was. Not only were we isolated in the valley, but the territory itself was a tinderbox of tension. Cavalry patrols, rival settlers, and the remnants of raiding parties made neutrality impossible. Every choice carried weight, and every day could bring new danger. Yet here, in this moment, we were united not by blood, but by circumstance and the shared desire for survival and freedom. Iona eventually approached me, her gaze unwavering as she studied my movements. She did not speak, but her presence carried the silent demand of respect and assessment. Ethel lingered behind her sister, cautious but attentive. It was then that I understood. These were not simply rescued captives. They were warriors and strategists, allies whose capabilities would change the nature of our existence on this land. By the time the stars dotted the night sky, we had established routines. I tended to the remaining cattle, while the sisters prepared the loft with careful attention. I noticed Ethel limping slightly as she carried wood, a subtle reminder that the scars of their past captivity were not just emotional but physical. The older sister, sensing my observation, shot a glance that needed no words. She had taught her sibling to mask pain, to endure quietly, and to survive with dignity. As I lay in my small bed that night, the events of the day replayed in my mind. The market square, the chains falling away, the cautious acceptance of my offer. For the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of hope. Yet, beneath that hope lay the constant awareness that the world beyond this valley was unpredictable and unforgiving. Allies here could be treasures. Enemies could appear without warning. Trust, once given, would need constant vigilance. And so, under the pale light of the moon, I resolved to prepare, not just for survival, but for partnership. This ranch, small and humble as it was, could become something more than a mere homestead. With the skills and intelligence of these two remarkable women, it might even become a sanctuary, a stronghold of freedom in a land riddled with injustice. The next morning, the valley was bathed in the soft gold of dawn. I could hear the faint stirring of the creek, the low murmur of the cattle, and the quiet movements of two figures already awake and observing. Iona had chosen the high loft above the barn, using it as a vantage point to watch the entire property. Even from my position near the water trough, I could see her scanning the ridges and trees as if assessing every potential threat. Ethel, ever attentive, followed her sister's lead, moving with careful, deliberate steps as she examined the feed and water barrels. I began my day as I always did, checking the horses, filling the troughs, and ensuring the fences were secure. Their presence beside me was comforting in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not because I trusted them blindly, but because they possessed a skill set that I lacked, an instinctive understanding of danger, of land, of survival. They didn't just observe. They analyzed, calculated, and prepared. By mid-morning, we were all actively engaged in the rhythm of ranch life. Iona handled the larger, heavier cattle, her massive frame and precise movements allowing her to control animals that might have otherwise resisted. Ethel focused on more delicate tasks, mending tools, tending to the smaller livestock, and preparing feed rations. The coordination between them was seamless. They communicated without words, gestures and glances conveying strategies and observations as naturally as any spoken conversation. It was during one of these quiet moments that I noticed a subtle change in the land. Tracks near the edge of our property caught my eye, disturbed soil and broken twigs that spoke of recent passage. Not the clumsy tracks of settlers or cattle rustlers, but deliberate movements of trained riders. My heart tightened. The territory was unforgiving, and threats could come from any direction. I decided not to alarm the sisters immediately, choosing instead to observe, to gather more information before making decisions. Iona, sensing my tension even before I spoke, asked with a piercing look, "Something is wrong." I hesitated, Knowing the truth of our vulnerability was something they needed to understand firsthand. "Tracks," I said simply, pointing toward the disturbed earth near the northern ridge. "Riders. Could be cavalry, could be raiders. Either way, someone's approaching, and they won't be subtle." Her eyes darkened with understanding. She knelt, examining the tracks with intense scrutiny, while Little crouched beside her, absorbing every detail. Even without speaking a word, they both conveyed the gravity of the situation. These were not women in need of protection. They were warriors capable of reading and interpreting the land far better than I ever could. I felt a surge of gratitude, tempered by unease. The next several days fell into a pattern, each morning a mixture of routine and vigilance. We worked side by side, tending the livestock, repairing fences, and surveying the land. I taught them how to recognize subtle signs of disease in cattle, how to anticipate weather changes, and the intricacies of managing feed for optimal health. In return, they shared knowledge that no manual could provide: strategies for observing territory, understanding the movements of animals and humans alike, and maintaining awareness in hostile environments. One evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, I noticed Iona perched atop the loft railing, scanning the valley below. The stillness of her posture suggested calculation, not leisure. I walked toward her, trying to catch her attention without alarming her. She didn't turn, but her eyes met mine with a silent command to watch and learn. I realized that every moment on this ranch was a lesson, not just in survival, but in foresight, strategy, and the understanding that power and strength were often invisible until required. It'll approached me later that night, bringing water and observing my injuries from the previous day's labor. She didn't speak, but her hands moved with care, tending the small cuts and bruises I had accumulated. It was a gesture of empathy, of trust, and I accepted it without hesitation. It was remarkable, this balance between strength and compassion, between warrior instincts and nurturing skill. Days blurred into weeks, and the valley began to feel like a fragile haven. Yet, the tracks we had discovered earlier never left my mind. They were a constant reminder that our small, carefully maintained refuge existed in a larger, unpredictable world. One morning, I noticed the faint glint of metal against the horizon. Saddles, rifle barrels catching the sun, and a formation that could only mean organized patrols. My pulse quickened, but I knew panic would be our undoing. Iona and Ittel, already aware of the approaching threat, moved with precision. Each action was deliberate, from positioning themselves near vantage points to readying makeshift defenses. I watched in silent awe as these two women transformed the humble ranch into a fortified observation point, their movements quiet but full of authority. I had learned quickly that my role was no longer that of a solitary rancher, but a partner in a complex, dynamic strategy, where every choice could determine life or death. That afternoon, the cavalry patrol arrived, horses kicking up dust as they approached the homestead. I could see the tension in their posture, the careful observation of the landscape. Iona and Ittel melted into the shadows, becoming part of the terrain itself, almost invisible until absolutely necessary. My heart pounded as I stepped into their line of vision, trying to appear calm, prepared, and most importantly, not alone. The leader dismounted, his gaze sweeping over the property with practiced scrutiny. I met his eyes evenly, letting him gauge the confidence and resolve that came from unity rather than fear. He approached, questioning the ranch's operations, but before suspicions could escalate, a subtle signal, glances, slight shifts, and silent movements, warned me of the sisters' readiness. They were not just observers, they were guardians. By the time the patrol moved on, convinced of the ranch's insignificance or deterred by our composure, I felt a profound respect for the strength and intelligence of my companions. These women, once captives and strangers, had become indispensable allies. We had survived the first test, but I knew more challenges lay ahead, each requiring vigilance, strategy, and the unspoken bond that had begun to solidify between us. In the quiet that followed, as night settled over the valley, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The ranch, small and humble, had become a crucible of trust, ingenuity, and survival. And as I watched Iona and Ittel move through the shadows, their silhouettes framed by the moonlight, I realized that our combined skills and mutual respect could turn even this remote corner of the world into a sanctuary, not just of land, but of freedom, resilience, and the beginnings of an unbreakable alliance. The following week brought tension that settled into the valley like a heavy fog. Even as the morning sun warmed the dusty soil and the creek whispered its usual song, I could feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing in on our small domain. Iona and Ittel moved with unerring awareness, their every glance and subtle shift reflecting a calculation that went far beyond ordinary vigilance. Their presence had become a steadying force, an unspoken command that the ranch, humble though it was not undefended. Our days were filled with the routine of ranch life, but the undercurrent of anticipation never left us. I taught them the intricacies of the cattle trade, the negotiation of feed and supply costs, and the painstaking calculation of seasonal grazing patterns. In return, Iona instructed me in survival strategies that seemed almost second nature to her, reading animal tracks not just for livestock but for human movement, observing wind patterns for signs of approaching men, and understanding how the lay of the land could offer both refuge and a tactical advantage. One afternoon, as I worked near the western fence line, Ittel approached silently, her movements precise and measured. She pointed to a narrow ridge beyond the creek, where disturbed earth marked the passage of more than a lone rider. "They scout," she said, her voice a low whisper. "Not yet cavalry, not yet raiders. But the eyes are coming." Her dark gaze met mine, steady and unwavering. The implication was clear. We were being observed, our every move catalogued, and the threat would escalate soon. Iona, perched on the loft railing above the barn, scanned the horizon with hawk-like intensity. Every shadow, every flicker of movement, was catalogued and assessed. From that vantage point, she orchestrated small defensive maneuvers, moving feed barrels, adjusting fence lines, and signaling subtle changes in our routines to make the ranch less predictable to outsiders. The work was silent but purposeful, each adjustment a silent message that we were aware, prepared, and capable. The first signs of organized danger arrived with the evening sun. Dust clouds appeared on the southern horizon, faint at first but growing steadily. The formation of riders suggested more than random raiders. These were coordinated, practiced, and deliberate. My pulse quickened, but I knew the moment for panic had passed. This was a test of readiness, of trust, and of the bond that had been forming between us since the day I had bid for their freedom. Iona descended from the loft with fluid grace, her boots silent on the wooden boards. She surveyed the approach, then crouched near a group of boulders that provided natural cover. "We must prepare," she said simply. "They will test the ranch. Not all tests are violent, but all are probing. Watch. Learn. Respond only when necessary." Her words were directive but measured, a command delivered without the need for argument. We spent the next hours fortifying the ranch quietly, using every natural feature and improvised barrier to our advantage. Iona and Ittel moved almost invisibly, each task executed with efficiency that bordered on artistry. They adjusted gates to allow quick cattle movement, concealed supplies in natural depressions, and positioned themselves at vantage points that gave them both observation and the element of surprise. I assisted where I could, learning from their methods and realizing the limits of my own experience. As night fell, the approaching riders slowed, their presence felt rather than seen. The shadows cast by the cliffs stretched across the valley, hiding movements and creating illusions that could confuse an untrained eye. We held our positions, silent and poised. The first rider reached the outer perimeter of our ranch, dismounting to investigate the subtle signs we had left intentionally. disturbed soil, footprints, and partially hidden paths. Each misstep they made was observed by Iona and Ittel, catalogued and prepared for potential use in our own strategies. Hours passed, the tension mounting as the riders circled, probing, assessing. I remained near the barn, my rifle within reach, but my mind focused on observation. Iona's eyes never left the ridges, while Ittel's quiet movements ensured no supply or hidden path gave us away. The precision of their work reminded me that survival here was not about brute force alone, but about intelligence, foresight, and the subtle control of perception. By dawn, the riders had withdrawn slightly. Their interest peaked but not yet escalated to direct confrontation. Iona and Ittel emerged from their positions, unbroken and composed, their assessment already complete. "They will return," Iona stated, her voice calm but resolute. "Next time, more men. They will test us further." In that moment, I understood the gravity of our situation. We were no longer just a small ranch with livestock. We had become a strategic point, a target in a larger game we were only beginning to understand. Yet, in the quiet aftermath, I also felt the strength of our partnership. Trust had been earned through shared labor, observation, and the quiet acknowledgement of each other's capabilities. We were not simply surviving. We were preparing, learning, and building a foundation that could withstand whatever came next. The following days were a mixture of routine and vigilance. Cattle were moved strategically, supplies rotated and concealed, and our patrol of the property became methodical, deliberate, and exhausting. Every sunrise reminded me that the frontier was unforgiving, and that even a small mistake could be fatal. But with Iona and Ittel beside me, I felt a sense of security I had never known. Not because we were invincible, but because we were aware, adaptive, and united. By the end of the week, the valley had transformed from a quiet, pastoral refuge into a carefully monitored stronghold. Natural cover, improvised defenses, and strategic observation points created a network of safety that would serve us well when the inevitable confrontation arrived. And even as the threat loomed closer on the horizon, I felt a grim sense of hope. Together, we could face the unknown, navigate the dangers of the frontier, and carve out a space where trust, honor, and survival could coexist. In the shadows of the cliffs, as night fell again over our valley, I realized that the true test of our alliance was not the threat we faced, but the unwavering commitment we had to each other. A commitment that could turn a fragile refuge into a sanctuary, and mere survival into a testament of courage and ingenuity. The morning air was unusually still, as if the valley itself held its breath in anticipation. I had risen before dawn, tending to the horses and checking the fences, but a sense of unease had settled in my chest that no amount of routine could dispel. Iona and Ittel moved silently through the barn loft, preparing themselves with a careful precision I had come to recognize as both instinctual and disciplined. Their dark eyes scanned the horizon repeatedly, noting every subtle shift in light, every hint of movement that might betray the presence of outsiders. By the time the sun cast long shadows across the valley, I could see the dust clouds forming again on the southern horizon. This time they were closer, larger, more deliberate. The riders approached in formation, their pace calculated, their intent unmistakable. They were testing us, probing for weaknesses, watching for any sign that the ranch was unprepared. I gripped my rifle, feeling the familiar weight in my hands, but I knew that brute force alone would not win this encounter. It would require cunning, strategy, and the unparalleled instincts of the sisters beside me. Iona moved first, descending from the loft and positioning herself near the barn's corner, her height giving her a natural vantage point over the approaching riders. Ittel followed, crouched behind a boulder, her eyes following every subtle motion of the enemy scouts. Their preparation was silent, yet every gesture communicated a readiness that was almost palpable. They did not merely react, they anticipated. I watched, realizing that their awareness extended beyond immediate threats to the very psychology of the men approaching us. The first rider dismounted near the perimeter, unaware of the trap that had been set. Iona's movement was fluid, almost ghost-like, as she intercepted him before he could advance further. I saw the subtle application of pressure, the precise manipulation of balance, and the quick, silent takedown that left him unconscious but unharmed. Itil mirrored her sister's efficiency, guiding another scout away from critical supplies, using nothing but her own body and the terrain to control the outcome. I felt a rush of awe and fear as I realized that what we were witnessing was more than survival. It was the disciplined application of knowledge that had been honed over a lifetime of hardship. The Apache sisters moved like shadows, blending strategy with instinct, ensuring that no harm came to the ranch or its occupants. Each action was deliberate, measured, and perfectly executed. As the remaining riders approached, the tension became almost unbearable. They had begun to understand that this was no ordinary homestead, but their strategy was still uncertain, their approach tentative. Iona and Itil used the terrain to their advantage, leading the scouts into areas where the natural landscape amplified their movements while concealing ours. Every rock, every tree, every depression in the ground became a part of the defense. Hours passed in a tense ballet of observation and maneuvering. I coordinated what I could from the barn, signaling movements with subtle gestures, but it was the sisters' instincts that dominated the engagement. They anticipated every route, predicted every misstep, and manipulated the environment to create illusions that kept the scouts disoriented. One rider after another was quietly neutralized, redirected, or led into blind spots where their presence could be monitored without confrontation. By late afternoon, the riders regrouped, their confidence shaken but not broken. They realized that brute force would not win the day, and the uncertainty of the terrain, combined with the sisters' ingenuity, had turned their advantage into confusion. Iona and Itil maintained a calm vigilance, their eyes never leaving the horizon, their movements precise and controlled. I began to understand the depth of their training and the breadth of their experience. Their actions were not simply reactive, they were proactive, anticipating threats before they became immediate, adapting strategies fluidly, and commanding the environment with an authority that left no room for error. Even in the face of potential violence, their ethical restraint was clear. No unnecessary harm, no cruelty, only the calculated enforcement of safety and defense. As dusk fell, the scouts retreated, their confidence eroded, their plans thwarted without direct confrontation. The sisters emerged from their positions, silent but resolute, and for the first time, I allowed myself a measure of relief. The first test of fire had been endured, and we had not only survived but established a pattern of defense that would serve us in the days to come. In the quiet that followed, I looked at Iona and Itil and realized that our partnership had matured. Trust was no longer merely an expectation. It had been forged in the crucible of strategy, discipline, and mutual respect. I felt the weight of the frontier pressing down, yet I also felt the promise of what we could accomplish together. We were more than a ranch, more than a refuge. We were a unit, capable of navigating the dangers that had already begun to close in around us. As the night settled over the valley, the lessons of the day were clear. Survival depended not on brute strength alone, but on awareness, foresight, and the unwavering bond of those willing to stand together. The scouts would return, and the frontier would continue to test us, but we had proven that we were ready. Our small ranch had transformed into a bastion of resilience, and the first true test had shown us that courage, strategy, and cooperation could bend even the harshest of circumstances to our favor. Even as sleep beckoned, I remained alert, knowing that the valley held both danger and opportunity. With Iona and Itil beside me, I was no longer just a farmer defending his land. I was a partner in a living, breathing defense network, one built on trust, skill, and the quiet power of those who refused to be broken by the world around them. And as the stars began to emerge over the cliffs, I knew that this was only the beginning of the trials that awaited us. The valley lay under a golden haze that morning, the sunlight cutting across the cliffs in sharp, unrelenting lines. It was a deceptive calm, the kind that the frontier was known for, a silence that was never empty, always filled with the potential for danger. I had barely started the day's chores when I noticed a line of dust clouds forming over the ridge to the east. They were larger, more organized than before, the unmistakable formation of a cavalry patrol moving with purpose. Iona and Ittel emerged from the loft with an alertness that made my heart both lighter and heavier at the same time. I had come to depend on their instincts almost as much as I depended on the land itself. The moment they saw the approach of the cavalry, they moved with practiced precision, silently coordinating positions without a word. Each step, each glance, each subtle hand signal carried instructions honed over years of necessity and survival. I prepared what little defense we had, checking the rifles and securing the perimeter, but it was clear that this was no ordinary encounter. The cavalry moved methodically, their disciplined formation betraying an intelligence behind the brute force. These were not scouts or raiders. This was a serious, well-trained unit tasked with testing, probing, and asserting control over the territory. They would not leave easily. Iona positioned herself atop a low ridge, the shadows from the early sun emphasizing her immense height. Ittel moved to flank, her movements fluid and silent, almost unnatural in their grace. Every aspect of their presence seemed designed to assert dominance over the landscape without revealing their true capabilities. I could feel the shift in my own breathing, the way fear and anticipation mixed with an odd sense of pride. We had prepared, but nothing could replicate the reality of facing men who were trained to hunt, capture, and control. The cavalry reached the bottom of the valley, their hooves sending plumes of dust into the air. Their leader, a captain with a sharp, calculating gaze, dismounted and signaled the others to spread out. The men fanned like predators, circling slowly, looking for any sign of life, any hint of concealment. Their pace was deliberate, controlled, confident, but their confidence masked an unease that we could see and exploit. Iona and Ittel initiated our plan. Using a combination of terrain manipulation and misdirection, they guided small groups of soldiers toward false trails, toward areas that seemed accessible but were in reality dead ends or traps that forced the cavalry into positions of disadvantage. The sisters' mastery over the land was unparalleled. Every ridge, every boulder, every shadow became a tool, and every movement of the cavalry was anticipated and redirected with precision. I coordinated my own efforts, using small signals to direct resources and create diversions, but it became clear that our true advantage was the sisters' intimate understanding of both the land and the human psyche. The soldiers began to falter, their confidence giving way to confusion. They were disciplined, yes, but their training could not account for the unpredictable strategy of two warriors who thought in 3 dimensions, who read patterns and movements like a language. Hours stretched into an exhausting, tense standoff. Every time the cavalry adjusted, Iona and Ittel had already prepared the countermeasure. They remained calm, controlled, almost serene, their faces unreadable as they orchestrated our defense. My own role became almost secondary, a facilitator rather than a leader. I watched in awe as they commanded the environment and manipulated the enemy without a single shot fired unnecessarily. By late afternoon, the cavalry began to show signs of frustration. The scouts and soldiers were beginning to lose cohesion, their formation breaking as they attempted to adapt to an enemy they could not see but whose presence they felt everywhere. Iona and Ittel, sensing the shift, tightened our control. They exploited the confusion, leading the men away from critical resources and securing every vulnerable point. Finally, as the sun began its descent behind the cliffs, the captain called a retreat. He had realized that brute force and training could not overcome the subtle, precise strategy we had employed. The sisters emerged from their concealed positions, their movements deliberate, unhurried, yet radiating the quiet authority of warriors who had just demonstrated that skill, intelligence, and unity were far more formidable than numbers. In the aftermath, I walked among the positions, surveying the valley. Every rock, every shadow, every piece of terrain that had been used in the encounter had been optimized by the sisters. Their foresight, experience, and tactical brilliance had not only protected US, but had also elevated our understanding of the land itself. That night, as we sat around the fire, the valley quiet and still once more, I realized how fragile our existence was and how strong our bond had become. We had faced trained soldiers, armed with discipline and experience, and yet survived with minimal confrontation, relying solely on strategy, intuition, and an unwavering trust in one another. Iona and Ittel shared a quiet moment, speaking in their native tongue, but I could see the satisfaction in their expressions. This was not merely victory, it was affirmation. Their skills, honed through hardship, were respected, utilized, and acknowledged. Our partnership had transcended mere survival. It had become symbiotic, a triad of trust, respect, and unspoken communication that could weather almost anything the frontier could throw at us. The lessons of that day were clear. In a world defined by danger, preparation, and the ability to anticipate, adapt, and control the environment, survival was possible. But more than that, it taught me that courage alone was insufficient. Strategy, intelligence, and partnership, the unity of purpose, were the true keys to enduring the relentless trials of the frontier. As darkness descended, the valley seemed almost to breathe in relief. For the first time, I understood that the ranch was more than land or livestock. It was a living testament to what could be achieved when trust, honor, and skill converged. The cavalry would return eventually, but with Iona and Ittel by my side, I knew we would be ready. Our small, quiet ranch had transformed into a fortress of resilience, and in that fortress, we were more than survivors. We were masters of our fate, at least for today. The morning sun poured across the valley once more, illuminating the Morrison Ranch in a way that made it appear both fragile and enduring at the same time. The events of the previous day, the cavalry's disciplined sweep and our tactical countermeasures, had left an invisible weight hanging over the land. Yet, in the calm after the storm, there was work to be done, and life never paused for reflection alone. I began the day with the routine I had come to cherish, feeding the cattle, checking the fences, and surveying the land. Iona and Ittel moved alongside me, their presence imposing yet reassuring. They had taken to the chores with an intensity and precision that reminded me of their warrior upbringing. They observed, learned, and then acted, seamlessly integrating their own methods into the everyday work of the ranch. It was remarkable how quickly they adapted, blending survival instincts with practical labor, all while maintaining a dignity that seemed to demand acknowledgement from everyone they encountered. The valley was alive with subtle movements. Birds flitted between the mesquite trees, rabbits darted into shadowed underbrush, and the occasional coyote's cry echoed from the distant cliffs. But even as the natural rhythm unfolded, the ranch had become a nexus for more than just animals and terrain. It had started to draw people. Refugees from nearby settlements, wary of the cavalry and desperate for sanctuary, began to trickle in. Word of the ranch as a haven spread cautiously, carried on whispers and discreet encounters at market towns or along the trails. Iona's intelligence and leadership quickly became apparent. She coordinated tasks with a clarity and authority that I could only admire. I watched her instruct a small group of newcomers on tending the livestock, her gestures precise, her voice calm but commanding. Ittel moved among the families and individuals, her eyes constantly scanning for signs of illness, injury, or distress. She offered guidance on preserving food, mending garments, and maintaining cleanliness, skills crucial for survival, yet often overlooked in the chaos of displacement. The bond among us grew stronger with each passing day. It was a bond forged not through convenience, but through necessity, trust, and shared hardships. The sisters respected my judgment and experience, but I came to rely on their wisdom in ways that went beyond the physical labor. Their strategies for survival, their understanding of human behavior, and their unwavering moral compass became a guiding force for the community we were creating. Evenings at the ranch took on a ritualistic quality. As the sun dipped behind the cliffs, casting long shadows across the valley floor, we gathered around fires that were not just for warmth but for the exchange of knowledge. Stories of past battles, survival techniques, and traditions of the Apache were shared alongside lessons in ranch management, livestock care, and the small bureaucracies of trading and bartering. It was an education in resilience, a synthesis of two worlds colliding and learning from one another. The local settlers began to notice subtle changes in the valley. Whereas the Morrison Ranch had once seemed isolated and vulnerable, it now appeared fortified by invisible structures of strategy, awareness, and collective intelligence. Visitors and traders remarked on the efficiency of the operation, the unusual discipline among those who worked there, and the sense that even the animals seemed to recognize the order and competence of their caretakers. Yet, this quiet growth was not without tension. The presence of refugees, the integration of different skills and backgrounds, and the ongoing threat of cavalry patrols required constant vigilance. Iona and Ittel instituted schedules, check-ins, and alert protocols. I trusted them implicitly, but even trust was not enough. Discipline and foresight were essential. Every new arrival was observed, their skills assessed, and their intentions discerned. The sisters had an almost supernatural ability to read people, a combination of intuition, experience, and situational awareness that made me feel both humbled and protected. During this period, I also discovered the personal dimensions of their lives. Through quiet conversations and careful observation, I began to understand the depth of their loss, the gravity of what they had endured, and the quiet determination that drove their every action. Iona spoke occasionally of her village, her words tinged with sorrow but also pride. Ittel's expressions often carried a restrained vigilance, a constant awareness of potential danger. They were both fiercely independent, yet had chosen to trust me and the ranch. That choice carried more weight than any physical barrier or weapon could impose. One day, a group of wandering traders arrived, their wagons creaking under the weight of supplies. Among them were individuals with knowledge of the terrain, hunting techniques, and local herbal remedies. Iona and Ittel assessed their skills and integrated them into the workflow. I observed as the sisters taught these newcomers how to anticipate threats, preserve resources, and operate efficiently in a landscape that demanded constant attention. The exchange was mutually beneficial. Skills were shared, trust was earned, and the ranch's capacity for resilience increased exponentially. Nightfall brought moments of reflection. Sitting on the porch, watching the lanterns flicker across the compound, I realized that the ranch had transformed into something extraordinary. It was no longer just a homestead. It had become a sanctuary, a hub of strategy and survival, and a testament to what could be accomplished when courage, skill, and cooperation intersected. Iona and Ittel, standing silently in the shadows or walking among the livestock with quiet confidence, had become symbols of resilience, guiding forces whose presence had redefined what it meant to live and survive in this unforgiving land. In these moments, I understood that the frontier was not merely a place of survival, but a crucible for character, strategy, and human connection. The bonds we were forming, the lessons we were learning, and the subtle power of trust and respect would be the foundation for whatever challenges lay ahead. The cavalry could return, the threats could intensify, but with Iona and Ittel, I knew that the Morrison Ranch was no longer just a collection of land and buildings. It was a living testament to unity, intelligence, and courage, ready to face the uncertainties of the wild frontier. Days at the Morrison Ranch had settled into a rhythm, a fragile harmony between labor, learning, and survival. Yet, beneath the surface of that calm, the land itself seemed to whisper warnings. Tracks in the soft earth, broken branches, and fleeting shadows hinted at movement beyond our immediate perception. Iona and Ittel noticed everything, as always, their senses attuned to the subtle signs that most overlooked. It was during the late afternoon, when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the valley, that I first saw them, a small contingent of riders moving cautiously along the ridge to the east. My heart sank, and I immediately began assessing the situation. Iona's presence beside me was steadying, her eyes narrowing as she studied the riders with the precision of a hawk. Ittel's fingers instinctively moved to the bow at her back, her body coiled in readiness. We had faced cavalry patrols before, and we had survived, but this felt different. There was a calculated patience in the movement of these men, a deliberate caution that suggested more than a routine sweep. Iona and Ittel shared a glance, an entire conversation without words. They had become masters of silent communication, a language born from necessity and refined by experience. Over the next hour, we observed the riders. They were scouts, skilled and disciplined, likely testing the valley for signs of the Apache survivors rumored to be in the area. Their approach was slow, methodical, and unervingly quiet. Iona crouched low behind a ridge, whispering directions and observations to Ittel, who moved silently to relay instructions to the others in our small community. Every movement was deliberate, every breath measured. I realized, with a mixture of awe and fear, that the sisters had transformed the ranch into a fortress of observation and preparation. Hidden lookouts, false trails, and strategically placed cover allowed us to monitor the valley without revealing our position. The Apache survivors who had joined us were quickly assimilated into these defensive measures, learning to blend, watch, and respond under the guidance of Iona and Ittel. As dusk fell, the threat became more imminent. The riders were closing in, and the valley's natural cover offered limited protection against those who knew the terrain well. Iona devised a series of signals, subtle and almost imperceptible, to coordinate our defensive positions. Ittel instructed families on evacuation routes and safe zones, ensuring that even the youngest and weakest members of our community could find shelter quickly. The efficiency was breathtaking. A small, disparate group became a cohesive, silent force under their leadership. Night descended, and with it came the tension of anticipation. Fires were dimmed, movements minimized, and every shadow became a potential threat. I patrolled alongside the sisters, rifle in hand, but it was clear that they were the true strategists. They understood terrain, timing, and human behavior in ways I could not hope to match. Their instructions were precise, their commands unspoken but universally understood. Hours passed with no direct confrontation, yet the psychological pressure was immense. Every creak, every whisper of wind, and every distant hoofbeat became a test of vigilance. Ittel moved among the people, checking positions and reinforcing morale, while Iona remained the comm center, the pivot around which all decisions turned. Their leadership was absolute, but not authoritarian. It was based on respect, trust, and an unspoken acknowledgement that survival depended on unity and skill. As midnight approached, we noticed a change in the scouts' behavior. They began to disperse, signaling either that they had found nothing or that their search was incomplete. Iona, sensing an opportunity, organized a quiet countermeasure. We reinforced weak points, set traps for those who might return, and created deceptive tracks to mislead anyone attempting to follow us. The community moved as one, silent and efficient, a living network of observation and reaction. By the early hours of morning, the valley had regained a deceptive calm. The threat had not been neutralized, only postponed, and we knew it would return. Yet, the successful execution of our strategies brought a new sense of confidence and cohesion. The survivors who had joined us were beginning to understand that they were no longer mere refugees. They were part of a system that valued skill, intelligence, and courage. I watched Iona and Ittel as dawn broke, painting the valley in soft hues of gold and orange. Their silhouettes, tall and unyielding against the horizon, were a testament to resilience. They had taken the chaos of uncertainty and transformed it into structure and strength. It was more than survival. It was mastery over circumstances that had claimed lives and broken spirits elsewhere. Throughout the day, we worked to strengthen our defenses further. Trenches, hidden observation posts, and emergency supply caches were established. Training sessions for the newcomers intensified, covering not just practical skills but situational awareness, silent communication, and psychological resilience. The ranch, once a quiet homestead, had become a hub of preparation, a microcosm of strategic ingenuity. Yet, even amidst these efforts, a sense of foreboding lingered. The cavalry would not abandon their pursuit, and the scouts' cautious reconnaissance had demonstrated that they were not merely searching, they were learning. Each movement, each adaptation, had to be considered with the knowledge that our enemies were intelligent, resourceful, and relentless. By evening, the tension had evolved into a strange rhythm. There was fear, yes, but also exhilaration, a recognition that survival required more than instinct. It demanded planning, foresight, and cooperation. Watching the survivors move confidently under Iona and Ittle's guidance, I realized that we had become something far greater than a ranch. We were a community forged in adversity, bound by trust, skill, and a shared determination to endure. The shadow of the valley had shifted, and with it, our place within it. We were no longer passive observers of danger, but active participants, shaping our fate with every decision and every movement. The lessons of the past, the discipline of the present, and the anticipation of the future converged in a living, breathing organism, the Morrison Ranch and its people, ready for whatever storms lay ahead. The first signs of movement came before dawn, barely more than whispers across the valley. I was awake, as usual, scanning the horizon, but Iona and Ittle were already in motion. Their tall, imposing silhouettes moved with the quiet confidence of hunters, every gesture precise, deliberate. The scouts were back, and this time their numbers suggested more than reconnaissance. They were testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses. I followed them silently, keeping my rifle close, but it quickly became apparent that my presence was symbolic. The sisters were in command. Every survivor had a role, every action choreographed to maximize efficiency and minimize exposure. The Apache women moved through our hidden observation posts, signaling with subtle hand gestures, their eyes flicking constantly to the ridge where the enemy scouts were gathering. By the time the sun began to pierce the horizon with pale gold light, the enemy had advanced closer than anticipated. Their horses' hooves kicked up dust in the quiet valley, each thump a drumbeat of tension that reverberated through me. Iona crouched atop a ridge, scanning the men through her binoculars, and whispered a series of commands to Ittle, who relayed them with silent gestures to our team below. Every adult and adolescent in our growing community knew their role. The young men and women moved like shadows, unseen yet everywhere. It was the first true test of the systems we had built over weeks. Traps were set to funnel the scouts into areas where we had advantages. Narrow passes where our visibility was perfect, but theirs limited. Misleading tracks and false trails were already in place to confuse any attempt to track the ranch's occupants. Each decision was a gamble, a silent conversation between the sisters and me, relying on intuition, experience, and trust. Hours passed, and the scouts approached the first line of deception. A series of false camps, hastily abandoned, suggested that the ranch had been deserted. Yet, hidden in the shadows, small groups of survivors observed, noting movements, counting horses, and tracking weapons. Ittle's voice was never raised. Her instructions came in nods and subtle signals, but their impact was unmistakable. She had become the architect of controlled chaos, turning every moment into a strategic advantage. The scouts, unaware of the observation points overlooking their paths, began to spread out, looking for signs of our presence. That was when Iona made her move. She directed a diversion, a small fire set in a hollow valley to draw attention, while another group silently relocated to intercept the scouts if they came too close. It was a dance of precision, almost imperceptible, but every survivor knew their part. I watched, amazed at how quickly our makeshift community had transformed. The ranch, once a simple homestead, had become a tactical hub, and the sisters were the unspoken generals. It'll positioned families in hidden groves, instructing them to remain absolutely still, while Iona moved to the high ridge to maintain visual contact with the scouts. Their coordination was seamless, a blend of instinct and learned skill, honed over years of survival under far more perilous conditions than anything we had faced at the ranch. The confrontation was inevitable. As one scout wandered into a narrow canyon, he triggered a trap we had prepared weeks ago, a line of carefully positioned logs and rocks that toppled with controlled precision, startling the horse and throwing the rider off balance. I had never seen such calm under pressure. Iona's eyes never wavered. She simply adjusted the next group's position to capitalize on the distraction. Chaos followed quickly. Another rider, disoriented by the sudden commotion, stumbled into a carefully dug pit, concealed by brush. It'll had anticipated the scout's route and had positioned the pit perfectly. The horse panicked, throwing the rider into a tangle of rocks. The remaining scouts froze, unsure of what was happening, their disciplined formation unraveling under the unseen pressure of our tactics. By mid-morning, it was clear that the scouts were disoriented, frustrated, and increasingly cautious. They had underestimated the community we had formed, and their attempts at reconnaissance were quickly turning into a game of survival. Iona and It'll moved through the valley with fluid precision, repositioning our people, reinforcing weak points, and ensuring that no one was exposed unnecessarily. The Apache women's leadership had transformed fear into organized defense, and even the newest arrivals moved with a confidence that belied their limited experience. I realized then that the test was more than physical. It was psychological. The scouts had no idea how many of us there were, how deeply our observation network extended, or how lethal our traps could be. We had turned the valley itself into an ally, and the sisters were its champions, using the land to guide, protect, and manipulate the enemy's movements. Hours turned into a tense afternoon, and the scouts began to withdraw, wary of further losses and increasingly uncertain of the ranch's defenses. The valley, silent once more, seemed almost to breathe a sigh of relief. Iona and It'll remained vigilant, however, knowing that this was only the beginning. The cavalry would not stop. They would learn, adapt, and return. But we had passed the first true test. As the survivors regrouped, their faces reflected exhaustion, relief, and a newfound sense of purpose. They had seen leadership that inspired confidence, strategy that protected, and a community that valued every life. The lessons of the day would not be forgotten, nor would the discipline instilled under the guidance of the two Apache women. By nightfall, the ranch had resumed its quiet rhythm, but the echoes of the day's confrontation lingered. It'll and Iona moved through the valley, checking traps, reinforcing positions, and speaking with families in soft, commanding tones. I realized as I watched them that the valley had become a crucible, shaping not just survival skills but character, resilience, and unity. For the first time, I understood fully that what we had built was more than a refuge. It was a force, and under the leadership of Iona and It'll, we had turned uncertainty into mastery, fear into strategy, and vulnerability into strength. The shadows of the valley had tested us, and we had endured. Dawn broke with a tense hush over the valley, the kind that presses down on the chest and turns every breath into a reminder of what's at stake. The scouts' retreat from the previous day had been temporary. The cavalry would return, reinforced and far more prepared. Our small community stirred with a mixture of fear and determination, but under Iona and It'l's command, hesitation had no place. Every survivor was positioned, every lookout post manned, and every trap double-checked. By mid-morning, the distant thrum of hooves echoed across the hills. Dust clouds rose in the distance, signaling the arrival of the enemy in force. They came not as scouts, but as an organized strike team, armored and armed, ready to assert dominance. Our people held their positions, silent but alert. The Apache sisters moved among them with the quiet authority of generals, issuing commands that were heard without words, gestures, glances, and subtle nods orchestrating the valley's defense. The first wave hit the outer defenses as predicted. A series of hidden pitfalls and tripwires claimed their attention, sending a few riders tumbling into carefully prepared traps. Arrows rained down from concealed positions, striking with precision and forcing the attackers to slow their advance. It'll had positioned families behind natural barricades, ensuring no civilian would be caught in the crossfire, while Iona led the older survivors in flanking maneuvers that isolated small groups of the enemy. Chaos and strategy danced together in the valley. The attackers were aggressive, but their overconfidence was their undoing. Every movement they made had already been anticipated. Rocks dislodged from high ridges crashed down, horses panicked, and their formation fractured. I ran alongside our defenders, seeing firsthand the courage that had taken root in our community. People who had arrived terrified, uncertain of their place, now fought with the ferocity of those defending their home, their families, and their newfound purpose. Hours passed in a blur of movement, noise, and controlled chaos. The valley became a theater of survival, a battleground where instinct met careful planning. Iona's calm under pressure was infectious. Even in the most dangerous moments, she seemed untouchable, every decision deliberate, every order precise. It'll coordinated ambush points, adjusting positions in real time, guiding her people with an almost supernatural awareness of the battlefield. By afternoon, the attackers had suffered serious losses. Their numbers dwindled, their morale shattered, and their coordination collapsing. The survivors, emboldened by their leadership, pressed the advantage, turning the valley into a maze of strategic pitfalls and unexpected resistance. The Apache sisters had transformed fear into tactical brilliance, their people moving like shadows, unseen yet omnipresent, striking decisively and vanishing before retaliation. As dusk approached, the battle reached its climax. A group of the most seasoned cavalry charged toward the ridge where Iona had positioned herself. I watched, tense and breathless, as she met them with unwavering resolve. The confrontation was swift, fierce, and flawless. Within moments, the remaining attackers realized the futility of further resistance. One by one, they retreated, beaten, exhausted, and utterly defeated. The valley fell silent once more. Exhaustion weighed on everyone, but there was a palpable sense of triumph. The community had faced annihilation and emerged stronger, united not just by survival, but by the courage, skill, and leadership of Iona and It'll. The survivors gathered in the clearing, faces marked by dirt, sweat, and blood, but eyes shining with determination and hope. We had defended our home. We had proven that the valley belonged to those who fought not just with weapons, but with heart, intelligence, and unbreakable resolve. And in that quiet victory, we understood that what we had built was far more than a sanctuary. It was a force, a family, and a legacy that would endure beyond the threats of any enemy. The morning sun spilled gold across the valley, illuminating the aftermath of the battle with a clarity that made every detail impossible to ignore. The enemy had fled entirely, leaving behind the evidence of their defeat, abandoned weapons, broken equipment, and a trail of dust that marked their retreat. The valley, which had been tense with fear and expectation, now breathed with a collective sigh of relief. Survivors emerged from hidden posts, faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion, yet alight with pride and solidarity. I moved among them, witnessing the quiet celebrations, hands shaken, embraces shared, and tears shed for both losses and the triumphs that had kept us alive. Iona and It'll stood together at the crest of the ridge, surveying the valley below as if the entire world belonged to them, not through conquest, but through endurance, intelligence, and leadership. The Apache sisters had not only defended a piece of land, They had built a community from fragments, inspiring courage where once there had only been fear. Their strength was tangible, not just in the force of their bodies or the precision of their tactics, but in the loyalty they had cultivated, the respect they had earned, and the vision they had shared. Jake stood nearby, observing them with quiet admiration. He had once been a grieving farmer, uncertain and haunted by the shadows of past losses. Yet, through the courage and resolve of the women he had freed, he had found a renewed purpose. Their partnership had transformed his small ranch into more than a home. It was now a bastion, a sanctuary, and a symbol of resilience in a world defined by chaos and conflict. The survivors began clearing the battlefield together, working side by side. There was no hierarchy beyond necessity, no distinctions beyond mutual respect. The children, previously scared and silent, now moved with confidence, carrying supplies, helping the elders, and learning the ways of survival from those who had endured and overcome. The elders guided with wisdom tempered by experience, teaching lessons of observation, patience, and strategy. The valley had become a living classroom, one where every member contributed and learned in equal measure. As the day progressed, Iona walked through the camp, offering words of encouragement, observing tasks, and quietly assessing the state of her people. Her presence was commanding yet comforting. She was both a guardian and a teacher, ensuring that while the immediate threat had passed, the community remained vigilant and prepared. Itil moved among the younger fighters, refining techniques, offering guidance, and instilling a sense of calm efficiency. Together, the sisters had transformed fear into capability, weakness into strength, and strangers into a family. By evening, the valley was quiet once more, not in tension, but in harmony. Fires flickered in the fading light, casting warm glows across the faces of those who had survived. Conversations flowed freely now, laughter punctuating the air as stories of bravery were shared and past tragedies acknowledged with solemn respect. Jake sat beside the fire, watching Iona and Itil coordinate the final organization of the camp for the night. He understood that their journey had not ended. The battles would continue in one form or another, but now they were no longer alone. The Apache sisters, standing tall against the backdrop of the setting sun, seemed almost ethereal. Their silhouettes were a testament to survival, to strategy, and to the unyielding human spirit. In their eyes was the reflection of every hardship endured and every victory hard won, a reminder that courage was never measured in size or number, but in the strength of will and the clarity of purpose. As night settled over the valley, the community gathered to mark their survival, their unity, and their hope for what lay ahead. Jake, Iona, and Itil stood together at the center, symbols of an alliance forged not by circumstance but by choice, not by fear but by honor. The valley had been defended, lives had been saved, and a new era had begun, one in which cooperation, respect, and bravery reigned above prejudice, greed, and violence. For the first time in a long time, I felt something that had seemed impossible to grasp, a profound sense of peace. Not the kind that comes from ignorance or avoidance, but the kind that comes from standing in the center of a living testament to human resilience, courage, and connection. Together we had survived, and together we would thrive. The dawn of a new era was not just on the horizon, it was already here. If you were in his place, would you have risked everything to save them? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and explore the other videos on your screen for more true Wild West stories.